I wanted to talk about Charlie Kirk and the hypocrisy I've seen between Republicans on the issue of Israel and Republicans on the issue of Ukraine. Because I'm seeing a lot of the same people who are saying, we can't spend all this money on forever wars. Oh, this is like a border dispute. In Ukraine, it's not worth it. Like that Euro-Atlantic security, the imperial land grabs, the promises we made to Ukraine that if they would give up the nuclear arsenal, that we would help them assure their territorial integrity. No. It's not worth it. It's an endless war. And now I see many of those same people coming out and saying, oh, Israel, give them everything they need. And for me, I thought the hypocrisy was like self-evident, but I didn't think anyone would try to address it. Because if you try to address it, you'll look pretty stupid because you're just going to try to waddle around your hypocrisy. Not to mention, like, the Israel-Hamas war is very different than the Russian invasion of Ukraine. For example, what Hamas did in southern Israel was awful. But is Russia occupying Ukrainian land, and it is Israel occupying Palestinian land in the West Bank illegally, which is recognized by basically every country in the world but the United States. So there's obviously different dynamics here. But under the idea that, oh, Israel's a democracy, like Ukraine's a democracy, and Ukraine is trying to protect its safety, and it's not an endless war, they've pushed, no, it is an endless war, it's not worth it. But they're trying to address this hypocrisy. And Charlie Kirk tried to address this hypocrisy. And man, do I think he failed. And man, is this a stupid post. We're going to read through it together. Israel is not Ukraine. And this is where the truth stopped. Okay, I'll agree with him on that one fact. That Israel is in fact a different country from Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is an endless war. Ukraine will never defeat Russia, no matter how much money or how many weapons we give them. There is no clear plan for winning the war. Okay, so let's start with these 3 sentences. Number 1, the war in Ukraine is an endless war. I don't know how you're going to say our deep involvement in this war really doesn't even extend back 2 years. And this is an endless war for us after 20 years in Afghanistan and a much longer occupation period in Iraq, that this is the endless war. We're not even 2 years into it, and we don't have troops on the ground, but this is the endless war. So going on 2 years, 8 years if you include the war in the Donbass, which we basically completely removed ourselves from, but 2 years when you come to the recent wave of fighting, and that's when Charlie Kirk tuned in. How are you going to say that 2 years is an endless war, but 80 to 90 to 100 years of conflict isn't? We have been giving military aid to Israel for the entirety of my life. Not only the entirety of my life, but also the entirety of my father's life, my mother's life, and I believe also my grandmother's life and my grandfather's life. For the entirety of like 3 generations of the Burns family, we have been paying tax dollars that has gone to Israel, whether it be for the Air Force, whether it be for the tanks, whether it be for the shells, whether it be for the ammunition, whether it be for anything, artillery, whether it be for the Iron Dome. Billions upon billions upon billions upon billions of dollars. Because Israel is, as of right now, and this was the policy of Netanyahu's government, is in a perpetual conflict with the Palestinians. As long as the occupation maintains, and as long as there are Palestinians who will want self-determination, they will show some form of resistance. And as long as you keep the Gaza Strip a pressure cooker of extremism and poverty and a lack of opportunity, blockaded with its water and food and energy able to be cut off at any time, then there will be conflict. As long as the issue of expansionist and provocative Israeli settlers is not solved, there will be conflict. As long as Iran's provocation and their funneling of weapons to terror groups and their backed militias that engage in violence, there will be conflict. All of these things that need to be resolved, all of them. But these are things that have been going on for decades. But that isn't an endless war. A country that we've been getting military aid to for who knows how long, for the entirety of my life, my mother's life, and my grandmother's life, that is not an endless war. But less than 2 years is. It just doesn't hold up. Ukraine is profoundly corrupt, and we have no idea where the money goes and who is siphoning it off. The hearing took place in October of 2019, and on November 21st, Netanyahu was indicted in cases 1,000, 2,000, and 4,000 for charges including breach of trust, accepting bribes, and fraud. As a result of the indictment, he was legally required to relinquish his ministry portfolios other than prime minister. You can go look into the Netanyahu corruption trial on your own if you want. He isn't the only Israeli politician that's gotten in trouble for corruption. Corruption is still an issue in Israel. Now, corruption is a bigger issue institutionally in Ukraine, but there has been no proof put forward that American aid sent to Ukraine has been siphoned off in corrupt schemes. I've seen Russia make that accusation. I saw Vivek Ramaswamy say that the Ukrainian government took American weapons and sent it to the cartels. And he said, oh, look at this javelin that a cartel guy is carrying. It wasn't a javelin. I think it was like an AT-4, an A4 or something. It was like a Swedish-made anti-tank weapon. Completely separate weapon. He didn't know the difference, and that's a guy who wants to make gun control in the nation. But there's been no evidence of that brought forward. There has been senators that have come over and monitored the process themselves, the digitalization of aid to try to keep track of it. And there has been multiple opportunities for Zelensky to come to the White House, come to the United States, and talk to legislators to give as much transparency as possible. You can put in more mechanisms for transparency if you want to. But when Zelensky came to the House to talk to legislators, he was snubbed by Kevin McCarthy because he was in a death struggle for the speakership, which he lost. And 4 to 9 legislators had basically began a jihad against Ukraine, and anything Ukrainian was evil. And you might think that's an exaggeration, but I keep bringing this up because it's insane. Marjorie Taylor Greene went on television and said that Ukraine is harvesting babies to fund the war effort, as in harvesting their organs. Making up some random Hey, once a QAnoner, always a QAnoner. Corruption is a real issue in Ukraine. But you want to know how corruption manifests? Let me tell you how corruption manifests. Let me tell you some real Ukrainian corruption scandals, since everybody has like a cartoonish view of it. This is how it'll usually work. You're a government minister. You have a friend. Your friend either owns a company or quickly makes a shell company. You have to fulfill a government contract. Let's say it's for something like body armor, right? We can tie it to the war in some way. But most of the time, it'll be something like, building a building or getting something for the government. And so you award the contract to your friend who either formed a shell company to take the money or had a company, and so they're awarding it through favoritism. And there's a good chance that the person who awards them the contract will end up getting a kickback. And I've been told many, many stories of politicians very blatantly just asking for the money to be handed to them under the table for these types of arrangements. That is how corruption in Ukraine works. Here's an example of it. Rebuilding efforts in Bucha. There was an example, and this was exposed by journalists in Ukraine, and I want to respect the Ukrainian press for a moment and give them that credit, that they're keeping up the pressure as the war goes on, because they know that anti-corruption efforts is important for continued aid, and they know that it's important for developing a strong and stable government moving forward, and if people trust their government more, they're going to be more willing to defend their homes and their land, because they feel that they have the government's backing. They found out that rebuilding efforts in Bucha, there was an example of somebody making a shell company, getting awarded a contract to rebuild a building. They then attempt to rebuild the building with no experience, mess up the building even worse, get the internal electronics and wiring of the building destroyed as well, because they destroyed the roof, and then the rain came and it destroyed the internal wirings. And you want to know what happened then? They got another contract to fix the damage that they caused to the building. That is some examples of Ukrainian corruption. What a lot of people think of Ukrainian corruption, this is the Charlie Kirk version of Ukrainian corruption, is we gave them a tank, and then Zelensky puts the tank in a big crate, and then they somehow smuggle it through the Black Sea. I don't know how, but they somehow do. and then they get it to Hamas and then sell it for 20 shekels. That is the cartoonish version of corruption people have in their mind when it comes to Ukraine. And there has been no acknowledgement, especially from American conservatives, not all of them, but definitely people like Charlie Kirk's ilk, of these reforms on corruption and the firing, for example, of recruitment heads all across the country when they found out people were trying to pay in order to get out of the draft, the rich kids of Ukraine. If you got money, you can get out of the combat. They're trying to do away with that by replacing those heads of recruitment with people who have lost legs and limbs and arms in combat, people who on principle are going to want to make sure that draft dodgers don't dodge the draft because they sacrificed quite a lot for the country. They want to make sure that nobody else can get out of it because they got some dimes to throw around. None of these efforts are acknowledged. I'm not saying that it's enough. They should continue. The pressure should continue from the Ukrainian press, calling out the corrupt people, calling out the oligarchs, not only for now, but for the post-war period. So the efforts that are necessary to rebuild the country are not trodden upon by these corrupt thugs. But when he says Ukraine is profoundly corrupt, what is implied is that we're going to send the aid over and then it's going to go poof, and then all the money's going to be wasted. I've seen American aid, like M777 howitzers, being used on the front line. I've seen our cluster munitions on the front line. I've seen American MREs, meals on the front line. I've seen our aid in all different places in this country. It is having an impact, and it is getting to the front, and it is having an impact. We saw the impact, the javelins, the bare minimum we gave them in 2019. Were railing the Russian convoy, the 40-mile-long convoy on the way to Kiev. If Charlie had an example of our military aid being funneled off, he would name it. But he doesn't, so he doesn't. And we have no idea where the money goes and who is siphoning it off. He can go to Ukraine himself and check. And there's been multiple senators, Republican and Democrat, who've come to Ukraine and said that they looked at the process and they believe the process is pretty solid. If he wants to go and he wants to talk to the ministers with a bunch of other conservative commentators, I'm sure someone would give him the time. He's just saying stuff that he doesn't know. To top it all off, Ukraine's war goals include seizing regions like Crimea, regions that are ethnically Russian, speak Russian, and want to be part of Russia. Okay, so first, there's two things. I didn't acknowledge the idea that Ukraine can never defeat Russia. So I don't know how you see a Wagnerite mercenary coup where Russia's own soldiers, rapists and prison murderers, are marching on the capital, shooting down Russian jets and command aircraft, and got, like, what? Not a few miles, but pretty close to the capital, and stopped and turned around after a deal had to be made with them because Putin was down to the point that they were digging holes in the road to try to slow down the convoy. And you say, after looking at that system, this system just can't collapse. It's impossible for this system to lose. I mean, they had no flank, but, I mean, no, it's impossible for them to lose. Remember how Russia won the first Chechen War? Oh, wait, they didn't win the first Chechen War against a much smaller opponent with much less support from the international community, that there was no means for the international community to even ship them weapons because of where they were located. But they could win the first Chechen War, fighting a terribly corrupt Russian government that mismanaged the military. Does that ring any bells? What about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan? It's impossible that these guys with AKs and a few stingers are going to be able to beat the Soviet war machine. It's impossible. How can you believe it? Even with the support of the United States and China, which, by the way, it's not mentioned much, but China supported the Mujahideen too. It's just not mentioned as much. It's impossible. It's a forever war. It'll never end. Till it did. Soviets left. How could Vietnam possibly stand up to the strongest nation on the planet, the United States of America? Well, it could. How could Algeria possibly think it could beat France? And it did. How could Angola possibly think they could beat the mighty Portuguese Empire? And then it did. Then it did. This aura of Russian invincibility should have been solidly smashed after the first month of the war. But the first months of the war have worn off for many people, and they have short-term memories like Charlie. And they only remember that the front line as of right now is not moving as fast as it did at the start of the war. And so they very quickly have slid into the idea that it's impossible for the Russians to lose, except for all the other times that they lost. It's impossible for Putin to be checked, except for all those times that he was checked. The idea that it is impossible for the Ukrainians to defeat Russia is silly. And it's being said by many of the same people who said that Russia wasn't even going to invade in the first place. I'm not saying Charlie said that. I don't know if he did or not. It's impossible until it happens. How are the Ukrainians still advancing in the south? How are the Ukrainians able to go man-to-man with the Russians? It's not a question of if the Ukrainians can beat the Russians, in my mind. It's a question of if the West has the political will to support them to victory. There's been a 50% reduction in government revenues. The Russian government has increased military spending to $111 billion. They are doing everything they can to try to salvage this war. They have gone from, we're going to demilitarize Ukraine, and we're going to conquer Ukraine and replace the government and demilitarize. All of those demands, while they're still voiced, it seems to be largely pushed to the wayside. And now it's, well, maybe we can hold on to Donetsk, Luhansk separation here, so on, and take the rest of Donetsk and Luhansk. Maybe we'll be able to do. Why are they moving their demands back? Why are they moving their expectations back? If not because they ran into some, let's say, pretty difficult issues. Look, I'm not going to tell you guys that Ukraine is going to win, because that's dependent on a million different factors. Just like no one could tell you in 1941 America was going to win, or any country was going to. It depended on a bunch of different factors. A bunch of different factors. But the idea that it is impossible, after we've seen the Ukrainians achieve the impossible time and time and time again, and we know that the Russians can lose wars, as they did in Chechnya, as they did in Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, they didn't just have Russia. They had Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Hungary, Czech Republic. I mean, they had many more post-Soviet states to pull people from. And they still lost. Charlie doesn't know if the Russians can win or lose the war. He is saying it because he knows that there's a section of the base that will roar for him. And for the last decade, I've seen conservatives praising Russian culture and how, they don't tolerate those gays. Oh, look at their military ads. They're so manly in comparison to ours. And then when the aesthetic collapsed, because that's all it was, they didn't have an explanation. But people are very comfortable in sliding back into the invincible Russia image, because Russia has worked for a very long time to build it, and something you know, a lot more comfortable than something you don't know. The war with Hamas is not an endless war. Oh, it's not like Hamas has ever gone into exile before, or that its leadership is overseas in other countries that Israel cannot access. It's impossible that it's an endless war, or that it could be replaced by another enemy like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is also in the Gaza Strip. I mean, we know that we know that Israel can lose wars. They lost the war in Lebanon. They went into Lebanon. They fought and they fought. They fought and they fought. They killed a lot more Hezbollah fighters than they lost Israeli soldiers, and they still lost and they left. The war with Hamas is not an endless war. Oh yeah, no. After this time, the Middle East will say, Israel, you're pretty chill. And all the Palestinians would be like, you know what? You convinced us. The objective is clear. Destroy Hamas and install a government in Gaza that doesn't embrace genocide as a founding principle. Does Charlie Kirk know that Israel has a good nation-state building policy, or Benjamin Netanyahu does? The same person who butchered his government's response to the butchering of his own people in southern Israel? Does he know that? Why is he saying it so confidently? There are thousands other reasons as to why the two are different. Israel is America's #1 ally in the Middle East. Okay? True. And Ukraine is an ally in Eastern Europe. Okay? It's geographically in the Middle East. Got you. Israel is the birthplace of Judaism and Christianity. I don't want to be blunt, but why should I care? Why should that matter to me? Am I supposed to be like the mass graves in Isium are less important than the symbolic birthplace of Judaism? How symbolic does a location need to be for it to be worth, like, how many people in a mass grave before it matches the symbolism? Israel protects the Holy Land. I wonder if he would care if I would talk about like how the Jews make pilgrimage to Ukraine for Jewish festivals, and I don't think Charlie knows that. I don't think he knows about the Jewish relationship with Ukraine, or the pilgrimages that are made here for religious holidays that the pilgrimages here for Jews to come here and celebrate their faith. I don't think he knows anything about that. But again, this is just religious mumbo jumbo. You could replace both of these lines with I'm a Christian and I believe Israel is important because I'm a Christian, and so therefore I'm fighting for my faith, and my faith is more important than the mass graves. That is what I'm translating this into. This isn't a holy war. Okay? God did not tell you to bomb the kids in Gaza. Israel is a real democracy and it shares critical intelligence with the US. Ukraine is a democracy. Its leader, Volodymyr Zelensky, is democratically elected. There was a peaceful transfer of power from Petro Poroshenko to Zelensky. After Petro Poroshenko lost the election, he did not say, oh, I actually won, and I'm going to strangle the democracy. He handed the reins of power over to Zelensky. There were international election monitors. Monitored the election. They said, yes, it was a free and fair election. So by what standard is Ukraine not a real democracy and Israel is, at the same time that the Israeli government is being lambasted by the vast majority of society to the point that it's degraded their national security in the IDF, the Mossad, and other security apparatuses, making people not want to serve them because of Netanyahu's crackdown on the judicial system that many people think is an attempt to save himself from the corruption charges. Is this really the best time to quote Israeli democracy versus Ukrainian democracy? This assumes that Ukraine isn't a democracy. It is. And this also assumes that Israel holds itself to a higher democratic standard than Ukraine, and also does not mention the fact that denying 1.1 million Palestinians in Jerusalem the ability to vote is a crime against democracy. As for sharing critical intelligence with the United States, we have gotten a lot of weapons data from Ukraine, and we have gotten intelligence from Ukraine. And maybe Ukraine would want to share more intelligence with us if we didn't have National Guardsmen leaking it on Discords named the Thug Shaker, the Thug Shaker Discord channel? I'm not advocating for direct U.S. involvement, but strategically, this much is clear. Israel can win. Charlie. I want to, instead of just me endlessly telling you guys why this doesn't make any sense, I want to cite someone who, even if I don't agree with him on the vast majority of topics, even he can see the hypocrisy on this issue. Ben Shapiro.
There is an interesting contradiction, I would argue, that a lot of conservatives in America, a lot of Republicans have, including a number of presidential candidates from Ron DeSantis to Trump and others, they have signaled that they would want to severely curtail, if not stop altogether, support for Ukraine. And yet Ukraine was invaded by Russia. A lot of people slaughtered, continue to be slaughtered. Is there not a contradiction there that these Republicans would be full square behind Israel when it happens to them, but not full square behind Ukraine?
I mean, yes, there's a contradiction. It depends on sort of what is being said about Ukraine, and it runs the gamut. And some of the candidates that you've talked about have talked about ending aid completely to Ukraine. Some have talked about continuing aid to Ukraine and pursuing some sort of deal with the Russians that allows them to keep part of the Donbass and Crimea, which I think is a completely different story and is an actual off-ramp.
This is the part that gets me. When he says this is an off-ramp to what? When I hear the term off-ramp, I don't understand, because it doesn't really matter if it's an off-ramp if it doesn't deal with the fundamental things that caused the war. Because if it's just an off-ramp and then you go 5 miles and then you get back onto the highway, you've achieved nothing except giving the Russians more time to prepare and taking away Ukraine's opportunity to take advantage of Russia's disorganization and mismanagement of the war, and kick the can down the road to another generation of Ukrainians who are going to have to struggle for their freedom. But off-ramp.
But yes, anybody who is sympathetic to Russia in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and then is sympathetic to Israel in this current conflict, that is a bizarre position to take. And again, I think that there are serious. America's a sovereign country. It has its own concerns that are not Israel's concerns, and it has its own concerns that are not Ukraine's concerns, and those zones always line up. But when it comes to possible contradiction between a completely isolationist position on Ukraine and an interventionist position or a supportive position on Israel, of course, those things could clearly be in conflict. In my own position, by the way, for what it's worth, since as you know, Piers, I do this for a living, my own position on Ukraine has been that the United States should continue to supply Ukraine with the support necessary in order to preserve its government and to preserve its territory. And meanwhile, there need to be serious talks about what exactly an off-ramp looks like in Ukraine, because virtually no one has spelled out exactly what that looks like. And virtually no one believes at this point that Ukraine is going to be able to completely take back both the Donbass and the Crimea region. That is not nearly the same thing as cut off funding for Ukraine.
When people say that virtually no one believes this, it is true that the odds against it are pretty large. The thing is, it's not like it's impossible to achieve it. The question is, what price are we willing to pay to achieve it in the West? What is the price tag we're willing to accept? We've seen the Russian army fail around Kharkiv. We've seen the Russian army fail around Kherson. We saw the Russian army fail around Kiev. We've seen Russian mercenaries march on Moscow. Is it really impossible for us to believe that with enough pressure, if we will, I mean, right now we spend, I think, 0.3 to 0.4% of our GDP on the war. Do you think, honestly, if we decided 4% for 2 years, that amount of scale of like, okay, 200 billion, and that's, we're already talking we're talking about a number that will never be proposed. But are we really saying if we didn't really want to and didn't really say, you know what, we're going to be stubborn on this, we made a commitment to the Ukrainians that if they gave up the nuclear stockpile, we would respect their territorial integrity, and it is an important message to send to the international community that if you give up your nukes, you will be protected, or the message is everybody get nukes or your territory is never safe. And that arms race around the world is not a good message to send. We could talk about Euro-Atlantic security, which was secured by our victory in World War II and the end of the Cold War. We want to secure that. We want to preserve that, as the Russians are talking about moving past Ukraine openly, saying that any post-Soviet state is someone they want to domineer over. He said that at the start of the war openly. When someone tells you who they are, believe them. Do we really think if we didn't really put our arm on this? I mean, the Russians have lost 50% of their government revenues and are putting so much. I think 33% of Russia's budget right now, or more, is going towards just the war. That I think it's 33 to 40%. We've dedicated 0.3% of our GDP. Russia, at that wild percentage, is still getting pushed back in the south. We're still seeing the Ukrainians launch special operations raids. The fact that Russia has dedicated so much and they're still seeing the Ukrainians match them man to man. And if we believe the data from the Jack Textera leaks, 2.5 men to 1 man, that was the death toll. That was the death comparison. For every 1 Ukrainian dies, 2.5 Russian soldiers die. Is it really impossible to think that? It's a question of tools. If you give me a bunch of shitty tools To build a house, you shouldn't be that surprised if I build a shitty house. Now, I'm not saying if you give me all the right tools that we know for sure we're going to build a perfect house, but the odds of it increases massively.
Ukraine and interviewed President Zelensky and met a lot of people there, and that was quite a while ago. There was an unbelievably steely resolve, and I would say the same resolve that Israel has about ceding any land now to the Palestinians. It's like they just don't want to give an inch of land away to the Russians. That was to a man and woman that I met out there.
I have an enormous amount of sympathy for that position. Again, that position does not necessarily dictate American policy any more than Israel's position with regard to, say, the so-called occupied territories.
And there we go, Ben. Woo! Transit. So-called occupied. It's occupied. The entire international community recognizes it as Palestinian territory and as occupied. It's just Israel that has an incentive to want to occupy the land who doesn't think it's occupied. So-called, and drops the ball. The hypocrisy is evident, man. The hypocrisy on the Russia-Ukraine stuff is evident when you compare it to Israel and the response we're getting from people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who says we should give Israel everything necessary. But when it comes to Ukraine, no, abandon it. I do want to show you guys one last thing on this. Now, obviously, Nick Fuentes is not a U.S. congressperson, but I do want to show you a lot of the thinking behind these wars and how a lot of these culture war warriors on the far right think about foreign policy, because they don't sit down and consider, well, did Ukrainians deserve freedom? Have they, are they a unique people deserving of a state? That's not the things they consider. Here's the factors that Nick Fuentes considers when deciding what side to take, even if you're supposed to take a side in a conflict, but if you are going to take a side, how he decides what side to take.
I'm going to be really honest with you. I don't care that much about this conflict, just like I really don't care that much about Russia and Ukraine. But just like with Russia and Ukraine, this conflict has severe consequences for our adversaries. And what are we? We are an American sovereignty movement. You understand what that means? We believe that the American people should have sovereignty over their own country. It means that we should be able to determine, we Americans should be...
There is probably not a country in the world that is more sovereign than America. There's no force that could invade us, no force that could fight us on our homeland. We disregard the International Criminal Court, and we have legislation in our laws right now that makes it's called the Geneva Invasion Act. Or I think no, it's the Hague Invasion Act. It was introduced during the Bush administration. If this is real, if the Hague decided to take an American soldier and try him on war crimes, it is within the president's power to send special forces into the Hague and get him out of there and leave. A small mini invasion. We are a very, very, very sovereign country. More sovereign than most. We're also connected to the world through a lot of ways. We're also a very globalized country. But those two things aren't necessarily contradictory.
Able to determine how our country is run and what happens in our country. We don't have that right now. Right now, our government is captured by foreign interests, one of which is Israel, one of which is the Jewish maximalist Likud party in Israel, which dominates our government. The Likud regime in Israel has captured our government. They're responsible for the censorship. They're responsible for the war.
It's weird that the Likud party has captured our government, but also Benjamin Netanyahu publicly scuffled with Obama multiple times, and the relationship between Biden and Netanyahu has been relatively frosty.
War in Iraq. And if Israel's genocide of Gaza is going to rally international support against them, then once again, this becomes a situation where the enemy of our enemy becomes our friend.
This is the same reason why he supports Russia. He thinks Ukraine has some hold over the United States, so Ukraine gotta go.
And so, although I'm an American and I'm an America firster, And on some level, I am ambivalent in a true sense about the outcome of these conflicts. We have to recognize their strategic importance. America is the seat of the liberal empire that controls the world. And we are enemies of that liberal order because of our old world views. And so to the extent that Russia is rolling that back, or China is rolling that back, to the extent that Israel is being led into a trap which will alienate it from the world and diminish its influence, then we have to support these causes.
His support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine is not based on what would be best for Ukrainians, what would be best for stability in the region, what would be best for the economic stability of the world. It's purely based on Russia's trad, America's libtard. So Russia winning Ukraine would be good because then to push back against libtard. That's the depth of his commentary. The mass graves, the war crimes, all of that, completely secondary. He's just sick of the homos on the TV. Fantastic.